All right, AP World students, I've got a heck of a story for you here today. One of my favorites in our course. Somewhat saddened that I can't be there with you to tell it to you in person, but I think you're gonna find it compelling and interesting, I think. So we're going back to Japan here, and I want to talk about the end of an era that we set up last time in the period 1450 to 1750, which was the way that Japan had decided to respond to, the Western powers, the Western colonial and imperial and industrializing powers. The way that they had chosen to respond was to kind of close themselves off, more or less shut the door to the outside world. We're going to look at the sequel to that story today. And our targets, I can explain how Japan's era of isolationism came to an end. And I can evaluate Japan's efforts to modernize and the way they did sort of eventually decide to open up their doors, whether they chose to willingly or not. And I can practice being a seeker of justice in examining world events. We can keep that moral lens of biblical justice as we examine this story. But let's just consider for a second where we were at, right? So the last time we talked about Japan, Japan was under the rule of the shoguns. The particular dynasty was called the Tokugawa shogunate. And they had kicked out the Portuguese pretty ruthlessly, we might recall, and gotten rid of the Portuguese Catholic missionaries and tried to expel all that. And they allowed the Dutch in on a very limited basis. You'll recall all this stuff, and just a little bit of trade. And sometimes, black market goods or ideas would slip through the cracks. But for the most part, Japan was able to spend the next century plus in near total isolation from the rest of the world. And their own internal rich cultural tradition, beautiful artwork, remarkable literary tradition, all these things were carrying on. The customs and the old ways of the samurai, even though the samurai were a little bit out of a job because the Tokugawa shogunate had kind of put a clamp down on all the internal civil wars between the local lords or daimyo in Japan. But the samurai were still kind of revered and honored and carrying on their ancient practices. And outside influence was just held at a minimum for a long, long time, until literally one day when I call it an intervention, or maybe you'd call it something else. They get a knock on the door. Hey, we're the United States of America, and we'd like to talk about what's going on in the outside world and how we can do some trade. And so this is going to send everything reeling in Japan. It's going to send everything spiraling, and we're just going to dig into the story and see what we think. So one day in the year 1853, Japanese fishermen spot something that is astounding to them. They say what they describe seeing is large ships that are on fire but aren't sinking. And what they're seeing, of course, is steamships powered by coal with smoke coming out of the smokestacks. They're not on fire; they're just sort of powered by coal. And these ships pull into Edo Bay and announce themselves. And the person leading this particular expedition is a guy named Commodore Matthew Perry of something called the United States of America. And he says, "Hey." To the Japanese, he demands to meet with the powers that be, and he gets put in front of some members of the shogunate and says, "So hey, here's the deal. I'm Matthew Perry. There's this place called the United States of America. Maybe you've heard of us. You probably haven't, but we're a new country, and we're going to be a pretty big deal someday. And we want to talk trade because we want to hunt for whale. I mean, the main thing the U.S. said, if you got anything here to trade, that's great. We certainly have stuff we'd love to sell you." But these waters are rich with whales, and we want to hunt whales because whale blubber is really useful to make kerosene lamps and to grease the wheels of our industrial machines, blah, 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 all this stuff. So the U.S. just says, we want to make a trade deal, like we do all over the place, like everyone else does around the world. We make trade deals. And so I want to show you a couple things. We've got steam power. I don't know if you do. I want to show you our guns. These are pretty cool, and what they can do. Do you guys have guns? No, you don't really. All right. We have cannon, too. We're going to show you these cannon. We'll give you an exhibition of all of our power, all the stuff we've got. All right. And so everything's nice and friendly. We want to sign this trade deal. We'd love it if you guys would do some trade with us. We want to open up for trade. We want you guys to open up for business. And tell you what, we'll come back in a year, and we want you to sign these papers. and then they leave as abruptly as they came. And internally in Japan, it's like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? At the court of the shogunate, they're saying we have no way of responding. If we said no and they said, well, you got to anyway. They can make us. We have no way of stopping them. And it's worth noting, compared to the rest of the world, the United States is not a military powerhouse at all at this point, at least compared to the rest of Europe. But compared to where Japan was after more than a century of being isolated from the rest of the world, the United States just absolutely has the drop on them. And so the shoguns are like, well, what are we going to do? Right? Do we sort of, some of the samurai are like, fight them. And everyone's like, you can't fight them. If you fight them, you lose. And then we get worse terms of the deal. You just got to go along with it. We just got to sort of open ourselves up to this. And everyone says, we're going to lose our whole way of life. Our government's going to fall out of power. What are we going to do? And so the shogun decides to make a deal. Fine. Sort of tries to bargain. If I fight with you, then that's the end of my power. That's the end of my rule. And that's game over for us. And we'll probably become colonial acquisition of this thing called the United States. So we'll instead sign a free trade deal. As soon as they do that, it's like, uh-oh, the French are here and the British are here and the Dutch are, not the Dutch at that point, but there's like other countries are showing up saying, we want to do the same thing. And suddenly Japan is laid wide open, and has to sign all these what we call unequal treaties. And it just sort of means an unequal treaty just says, hey, when we do business here in Japan, you can't tax us. You're not allowed to tax us. And when our foreign merchants and government officers show up in Japan, they aren't subject to your laws. And you can't prosecute them or touch them. If they do anything bad, you let us know and we'll deal with them ourselves. But they aren't subject to any of your laws. They have what are called extraterritorial rights. And so it's basically the outside powers led by the United States are just dictating terms to the Japanese. And the Tokugawa the Tokugawa shogunate is disgraced by this. And they fall from power. I'll talk about what happens in a second. But other people there's a coup and they remove the shogunate because it's like, now we're humiliated. Now we're totally weakened and embarrassed. And we were not prepared for this to happen. You'll see in here a lot of these. I love these Japanese illustrations of sort of something that they don't quite have eyes for. Like the way they depict, Caucasians is always humorous to me. This is their depiction of a steamship. And this is something that a student wrote on the margins of their notes once, and I loved it. Hard to really argue that that's kind of what was going on here in this particular exchange in 1853 and 1854. And so it's interesting at this point now to sort of compare. China is in a similar spot, Japan is in a similar spot that China was in, right? So like China, they faced an intervention from powerful European or Western powers, right? And they had been somewhat closed off and reluctant to open themselves up to trade because they felt like they, meaning Japan or China, wanted to be able to dictate those terms. But they get sort of forced open to this. Now they can't dictate the terms of anything. Now they're at a severe technological and military disadvantage. And where China just sort of fell apart and was not able to respond, Japan responds really differently, drastically differently. And Japan ends up saying, basically, if you can't beat them, join them. Let's become an industrialized imperialist nation ourselves. And so about a decade after this initial being opened up to trade and then being humiliated, the shogun is removed from power by the daimyo, who are, again, these landlords. And the daimyo, they're doing a coup, right, which is very dramatic. And in order to kind of appeal to or appease the general Japanese public, they say, no, to make their coup seem less dramatic, they say what we're actually doing is restoring the emperor to power, the symbolic figurehead emperor, who was a 15-year-old at this time, the Emperor Meiji. And so that's why this move is called the Meiji Restoration. But it makes sense to you, right? Like if someone else is deciding to restore the emperor to power, the emperor isn't really the one that has the power. It's the people that are putting the emperor in power that have the power. They're the ones actually making this decision, right? And so this Meiji Restoration gives, again, sort of symbolic significance to the emperor, like it always was. But really, in effect, the real power was with this new government that they were creating, That was an oligarchy, means a rule by the few, a rule by the powerful, like an elite clique of leaders are making the decisions. They did create a legislative body, kind of a token legislative body, a parliament called the Diet. Not many people could really vote for it. You had to own land and be wealthy to be able to vote for it. But it's sort of like a gesture at kind of a liberal style government, meaning a government rooted in rights. That's not really what it was, though. This was a rule by the few whose mission was, we want to modernize and catch up to the outside world. And so, like I said, they take this approach of if you can't beat them, join them. And they decide to industrialize and modernize and westernize in this really, really distinct and interesting way that I'm not fully aware of any, I'm not aware of any place that really did it to the same full extent, where they basically said, okay, let's just mimic what the Western powers are doing. And they send delegations to Britain, to Germany, to the United States. And they say, Germany, we want to learn about how you do your university systems, which are like the best in the world. Britain, we want to learn about your factory, your military stuff. And so we want to learn from you. We're going to send our scholars there to study you, take notes, bring them back here. Americans, we want to go and learn about your factories and industry. We're going to go take all these great notes and we're going to come back and we're just going to literally mimic that. We're going to copy that. We're going to sort of take these ideas from these other places and put them in and implement them here. And it's sort of funny because they don't just implement Western style militaries and Western style universities and Western style factories and industries. They start to, and public schools as well, they also grab a whole bunch of cultural elements. It's almost as if they're saying, we're not sure if the magic is in the factories or the military or the government style or the petticoats and the harpsichords. I'm not sure where it is. So we're going to just grab it all and mimic it all. And we're going to sort of mirror Japanese cultural and economic and political and military life after what they do in the West. And so it's this very, very conspicuous period, this Meiji Japan period. It's a very conspicuous period of copying. And so we see these Western style factories opening up. Now there's still, you can see women dressed in kimonos doing a lot of this work. We will note there's a lot of women doing the work here. That is noteworthy. But then here we see some of the women of the upper class from the daimyo's family wearing fancy frilly petticoats and hats, and again, listening to harpsichord music. And there's a little boy by the sitting chair dressed in his military uniform and Western style military uniform. He ain't dressed like a samurai, that's for sure. And so it's this cultural overhaul happening in a very short period of time. It's quite striking. At a certain point, after about a decade of this, the old samurai just say, enough. And they say, we have to fight for the olds, to preserve the olds. They recognize they're being usurped by these new military forces that are being created, in which they basically take a bunch of peasant farmers and hand guns to them and send them to boot camp. And the samurai are like, no, we have to fight in the traditional ways, the ways that are closely connected to our culture. And so they rise up and fight back against the Meiji industrialized Japanese army, and they get their rear ends handed to them, and the samurai are made extinct. They are dismantled, taken apart. Tom Cruise was there. There's a movie about it. It's called The Last Samurai. The Last Samurai apparently was Tom Cruise. Things he didn't know before he took AP World History. Anyway, so that is the end of the samurai class, dismantled as a cost. Something you got to drop from the olds as you move to the new. What do you think of this, students? How are you reacting to this? And so Japan is now saying, we've become an industrializing power. And it's interesting, they run into some of the same problems that Britain did. We got all these sweet, sweet factories. You know what we don't have? Resources. So where can we get resources? Maybe by colonizing and becoming an imperial power. Maybe we can become an imperial power just like the Western powers are. Why couldn't we? We should be able to, and it follows the same internal logic. And so they begin expanding, first on the islands off of Japan, then onto Korea. Soon enough, this leads them into war with Russia. Remember that? A war that they won. And the Western powers start saying to themselves, look out for Japan. These guys are kind of interesting, right? They're using our playbook and they're expanding and they're a formidable force. And there's a lot of kind of satisfied nods from beyond of like, Japan, not bad. And I'd say in the 20th century, this militaristic streak will take a dark turn. But we'll explore that more down the road. Anyway, so that's our story here of Japan in the Meiji period. consider the differences, the contrasts in what Japan experienced and how they responded with what happened in Russia, with what happened in China or the Ottoman Empire. Makes for an interesting story. Anyway, thanks for hanging through this, guys, and I'll see you next time.